Hello everyone, good to see you here at IBC. Thanks very much to latakoo for inviting me to come and give a bit of a presentation on the booth here about some of the trends that we're seeing at Coretta Research into the newsroom tech market. So let me just start with a little bit of my background. I actually, a little bit like Jade at latakoo, was a journalist and then kind of turned techie. So I found out this photograph of me in what a newsroom used to look like, with good old basis screens, which any journalist of a certain age will remember with fondness. There's probably a typewriter in there somewhere. And I notice, I have no recollection of this photograph being taken, but you'll see the time is 6:25 in the morning, because of course that's the sort of hour you used to have to work as a radio breakfast editor, which is what I was doing then. I suppose in those days it was very simple though. We had radio, we had television, we had pretty simple tech. It's fair to say that the world is a lot more complicated now. And indeed, a lot of what we do at Coretta Research, we founded our company 3 years ago. We focus on technology and analysis in the media and related industries, so areas like sports and ad tech and marketing tech. We kind of recognize the need to unpick the complexity of that industry and really make it simple for people. So that's what we do. And actually one of the areas among many that I look at because of this little background of being a journalist and using the tech hands-on is focusing on the news tech market. So let's see, we've got 5 key trends that I'd like to talk about today. Firstly, and this is based, by the way, on a lot of discussions that I've had with newsrooms around the world. So one thing that we do at Coretta is we talk to people who buy and use technology all of the time and figure out what they're actually doing with it. Not what the vendors at IBC would like to think they're doing with it, but what they're actually doing with it. So one of the first trends we see, and we'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail, is enabling people to be out in the field actually gathering and creating news, not stuck back in the office processing it. Historically, far too many journalists have been stuck in the newsroom processing other people's stuff. Now the trend is to have people out in the field actually creating that news. Number 2, of course, is producing that content for more and more platforms. But when we see how people are actually doing it, it's really quite interesting, the approaches that newsrooms are taking. Number 3, journalists want much easier and quicker access to source material, to content, to video, to archives, to information. And that's a huge driver. And I've seen some really cool AI tools around here at IBC that are really starting to deliver that vision. Interestingly, despite this sort of collaboration around all of the platforms, one trend that we see is that when it comes to actually creating the news output for those platforms, there we see a lot of tailoring and hands-on approach. And the smart newsrooms are recognizing that, say, a platform like TikTok is really quite different to producing a 7 p.m. newscast. And you can't necessarily just take the same people and the same text and the same video and expect it's going to work on both. And then, for that reason, using the right tools for the job becomes really important, and that's kind of guiding the way that newsroom tech is shaping up. So, I'll spend a couple of minutes on each of those and drill into those in a bit more detail. So another photograph I found in my archive. This was from more recently. This was, although still nearly 20 years ago, and I got involved in a test to try feeding video back from the field. I had a Nokia phone with whatever it is, 1.5G connection. Anyway, it didn't work very well. It was fun to try, but it didn't work. But you could see that even 20 years ago, the focus was on thinking about how do we get, because when I was running the planning desk in a TV newsroom, I spent a lot of my time getting motorbikes and taxis to take videotapes around. So when we get content back from the field, it used to be I would send a bike or a taxi, and then hopefully it might come back to the newsroom in time. And that actually meant you often had to have your crews out filming really early if you were going to hit the 1 p.m. show. So that was 20 years ago. Now, actually, the challenge has evolved and become a little bit different, because thinking about working in the field, it's a bit more complicated, because now we have obviously non-linear editing. We have cloud-based production tools increasingly. And so you've got this slightly complex scenario where do you want this content to be? You may have a reporter and a photographer out in the field. And so obviously we're capturing content on the camera card, and we'll have a laptop out in the field. And so it may be relevant to actually just stick the camera card into the laptop and start editing. But then how do you get that back to base? And then where is base anyway? If you're using a cloud-based production tool, which is increasingly becoming popular, that's also in the cloud. But equally, people also want to be able to run back with that camera and run through the door with the camera card in hand 5 minutes before the newscast and immediately start editing that content. And in that case, it doesn't necessarily work to first have to upload it to the cloud before you can work with it. And similarly, even if you are working out in the field and editing, chances are the package that you're putting together is not going to be only content that's in the camera. You may want some archive content or some material from a press conference that someone else was shooting. So the dilemma that we see all the time that journalists have today is, where should my content be? And how should I edit it? Should I be editing it in the newsroom on a server-connected system? Should I be editing it in the cloud on a cloud-enabled, maybe a web-based editor? Or should I be editing it on a laptop in the field? The answer actually is all three of those most of the time at the same time. And so the real challenge, and that's kind of why it's somewhat relevant to being here on the latakoo booth at IBC, is how do you get that content around from place A to place B to place C all of the time? And another reason that people, newsrooms want their key people out in the field is particularly in the US market, where affiliate stations are having to do more and more hours of airtime because the networks are putting all their best content on their streaming platforms. And so now the local affiliates are having to fill more airtime with news. There's much more live content. And that's great because there's ways of getting that live content on air using bonded cellular so much more effortlessly than it was in the past. But then once your journalist is out doing endless numbers of live stand-ups, again, they've got to be able to be fully functional when they're out in the field. So the challenge is making the people as efficient and giving them the same tools in the field as they have back at base, and then making sure the content is in the right place. The second big theme that we talked about then is this idea of cross-platform planning and collaboration. So we've heard, there's been this sort of buzzword in the industry for quite a while called story-centric. And it means actually so many different things to different people. And it's been a term that's been adapted to mean whatever people want it to mean. But actually what we see, the big trend that we see now, and this is a recent trend, is a move away from working in a traditional newsroom computer system rundown or running order as being the primary place that news is created and written, towards using tools. This is an example of Wolf Tech, which is one of the planning tools that's available. There are many now. But what we see is that sort of work is moving upstream. So long before somebody's actually writing a script for a TV package or an intro, we're seeing these tools being used to plan the news agenda, what assignments, the resources in terms of who's going to be covering that particular story and where they're going to be, putting all of the facts and information about a story into one place, contacts both the team that's working on it, but also the contributors who may be being interviewed, figuring out who's going to be where, when, and then also increasingly starting to put the media. So we talked in the previous slide about how people are working in the field. Where's all that stuff going to go when it comes in? How can people get access to it? I've seen some cool new tools here at IBC for cloud ingest for news. So if you're ingesting stuff into the cloud, where are you going to see that feed appearing of the press conference? And how do you find quickly the bit that you want? So all of this sort of content, we're starting to see the rise of some people call it a story container. So you've basically got one bucket where all of the stuff ends up. This is a real kind of transformation from the old way, where yes, you would have an assignment desk and yes, you would plan, but actually it was all focused around the TV news bulletin still. And that's where really the agenda was set and the scripts were written. In the bigger newsrooms now, we're seeing that move upstream. And then all of the different journalists who may be dealing with the different formats and outputs of this news can dip into this same pool, get access to the raw information, the facts, the details, the content, and then version that story for their output. Whether it's a traditional TV bulletin or a TV-like bulletin that's on a digital platform, that's a big growing thing. Radio, obviously the best medium of all. Longer form web stories that have got much longer form text and many more graphics and images and video. The Twitter or X post, which is obviously the short form and happening much more frequently. Video for different platforms in different formats and different audiences in the form of short form content. And then quite a lot of newsrooms that I speak to have actually grown up as being print and then have grown into digital and broadcast. So quite a few people are also doing newspaper and magazine publications as well. So we see this tool in the middle becoming increasingly important, and it may be an off-the-shelf piece of software like this example. It may be a homegrown tool quite often, or in some cases people are using tools like Trello that are kind of more standard planning applications. So we see lots of ways that problem is being addressed. Now, once you're working in that container and the story is developing, the next question is, where do you get access to all of the information about that story? And one of the big trends we see is a desire to have quicker access to the context of the story, the archive relating to that story, all of this incoming material, access to the relevant parts of it. One thing that comes up quite a lot is journalists say, if I'm now covering the story, I want to know who else in my organization is the expert on that topic, so I can message them quickly and get the context. So these are the sort of questions that come up. How do I get a specific piece of archive clip about a politician talking about a particular subject? If I've got a news feed coming in of a press release, press conference, how do I find the 30-second soundbite in the middle of that? I want a very specific bit of archive footage to illustrate my story. Or I know we did a story on this a year ago and I need to find the damn thing and reuse part of it because now I'm doing an update. So we see a real trend towards providing tools that let journalists be more productive finding this stuff. And I think that's where it's kind of the joke of IBC that everyone has to have an AI story. And a lot of it is still marketing BS. But actually where AI is really finding its feet is in simplifying the busy work. So if you can quickly find stuff in the archive by typing in almost a free text search. I saw a great demo earlier of AI indexing on top of a very large news agency archive, and someone was able to type in Biden eating an ice cream, and it would immediately pull back pictures of that had never had that as metadata, but had been indexed by an AI process to be able to do that. And that's the kind of tools that journalists want to be able to get to the right source information. So we talked about the importance of then, despite maybe being more collaborative across all of these platforms, when it actually comes to producing the output for them, that's where we see the opportunity to be much more tailored and specific. So this is a bit of an example that I've put together of what it often is like today or has been in the past, where you've got a TV news script that's part of a TV rundown, and in many cases, and actually sadly still the case, you may find that actually the Twitter post in this case, and this is a made-up one, it's not a real news organization, is basically, it's a Twitter post that's the TV package. We've taken some text from the TV package and some video from the TV package, and then that's what our social media post is. Well, that really doesn't cut it in the sort of digital marketplace where it's hyper competitive. And in actual fact, this is okay if you see your social media platform as just being a route to draw people back to your TV newscast, and maybe that's important, but actually increasingly what people want to do is serve those digital audiences independently. And that means a different approach altogether. So think about what an actual story timeline might look like and think about that planning process that we had in place. We might start off with our breaking news, and obviously we want to do a series of quick posts on Twitter, X. Sometimes that might be coming straight out of that initial planning process because we've got the breaking news and the facts. A lot of people are now going live quicker on social media platforms. So even organizations whose primary outlet may still be the 6 p.m. news are using things like Facebook Live to get live with the breaking news. And that requires almost like self-operated control room that you can go live and put it onto Facebook or YouTube or your own website or all of the above. So that's something that we see. Then as the story grows, you get into that sort of traditional news reporting package. So you might do your TV package, but you might also do a short form package with a different editorial agenda, different aspect ratio, of course, and burned in subtitles where you've actually got to tell the story in text on the screen as well as through the voiceover. You might do different versions of that same story in different languages or different lengths for different platforms. And then maybe later on there's a longer form digest of that story on web that's written by a text writer rather than a TV writer, and has more immersive graphics and images, but also then is written with SEO and tagging in mind. And then maybe there's a print story, and then later on we come back to this story for a recap and maybe a documentary for it and so on. So you can start to see now that you have all of that collaboration up front and getting all of the content in one place. And then what you want to see down the line is the ability to plan how that story is going to be exploited across all of these different platforms at different points in time. And actually we see this sort of timeline view coming into the newsroom workflow. Sometimes it's just a case of managing breaking the news, but actually also there's sometimes a bit of a planning process about figuring out how we optimize which platform the story is going to be distributed on at any one time. The key thing there is that the smart newsrooms are not just taking one story and then putting it on different platforms. They are understanding that each of those platforms has its own audience, its own editorial agenda, its own style, its own treatment, and they're really focusing on having specialists who understand how to deliver that audience for each of those. If you think about it, it makes as much sense to ask a TV journalist to write a Twitter or maybe a TikTok video as it would be to ask a TikTok creator to produce your 6 p.m. newscast. So, it's about having people who understand each of those formats and can optimize for them. So that then leads to the fifth theme, which is having the right tools for the job. It was always the case in the past that it was the newsroom computer system that did everything. Tools like Basis in the olden days that we saw at the start, and then more recently tools like Avid iNews and AP EMPS and Octopus and CGI. Those sort of tools were the one size fits all, you did everything in them. But now what we start to see, and those tools still play an important role, but now you start to see other tools around them. So we've got the planning tool, and that could be a dedicated news planning application like WolfTech, and indeed many of the traditional NRCS vendors also have the same version. But people are also using general purpose project planning tools with varying degrees of success to do that. Interestingly, as more of the workflow moves out of the NRCS into these tools, the role of the NRCS is evolving to become much more focused on the rundown for the TV or the radio news. And so if you like, the traditional NRCS's scope is shrinking in the workflow. And then you see the rise of dedicated rundown tools coming into the market that just do the scripts and the rundown. So there are vendors like Tinkerlist that are focused on just that piece of the market. Collaboration is really important in the newsroom. So you, in the traditional sense, would have been using messaging built into the NRCS. But these days, maybe you're using your Slack or Teams or Google Workspace to do that. And increasingly, journalists expect to, a lot of journalists have actually adopted non-newsroom systems like Google Docs. Because, unlike traditional systems that they've used in Google Docs, suddenly everybody can collaborate in a story all at the same time. We journalists are very, very good at kind of finding tools that do the job and bypassing the official routes. So basically, if the techies are not providing the right tools that the journalists want to use, they're very good at finding them. And it's amazing how often things like Google Docs are being used as a sort of guerrilla tool in the newsroom. We've also got the web CMS, and that's really interesting. The web CMS is a really important part of modern newsroom workflow, having that dedicated place that you can create the web content, but also managing it in a way that works for SEO. The smart web CMSs will actually guide journalists in how those stories are written and structured to maximize engagement. And they will have the stats about what stories are being consumed in the online platforms that will also help guide the journalists back. So it's interesting how the web CMS has become just as important a tool in many newsrooms as the traditional tools. And then, of course, tools to manage and process the video. So video delivery is important. So tools like latakoo for getting content back from the field. We see bonded cellular becoming really important for live feeds, as we said. People have spoken to me about the traditional satellite or microwave truck being parked in the garage gathering dust, quite literally, because now journalists just go out with a backpack. And then, of course, a whole range of tools for editing and processing the video. So I think the point being is now we're seeing a much wider range of more loosely integrated tools coming into the workflow rather than necessarily expecting there's one big product that does everything. So let me just recap 5 tech trends that we've seen that are really kind of responding to how journalists and newsrooms are changing, and also being driven. You know, some of the new tech is driving this as well, enabling this. Make sure that the journalists are just as productive in the field and have access to all the same content, all the same video, all the same information when they're out in the field as when they're back in the newsroom. The rise of the story container, the planning tool that actually drives the editorial agenda and creates the base story that can be then exploited across all of these tailored platforms. Easier access to all of that content, search and discovery, and again, getting it back to base quickly and having it all in one place, and then using a loosely coupled selection of tools to do the job. And I'll get a quick plug in as well. Just for background, this is what we do. We work with both the suppliers of many of these technology products as well as the buyers. And so I think it's clear from this discussion that the way the market changes, the way that workflows change, driven ultimately by platforms and changing consumer consumption of this content, that all feeds back into the way people work on the technology. So it's a very complex market. And our kind of mission is to care about helping buyers and suppliers navigate and understand that more effectively. So that's what we do. And thank you for having me here. Hope it's been useful. Yes?
Have you done any research as to the acceptance of an iPhone or Android phone capturing content? What are they accepting?
Oh, being used daily, all of the time, all of the time. I mean, it was interesting when Euronews was relaunched, and actually I remember being here at IBC, when I was involved in producing the conference, we had the then head of Euronews. They just completely relaunched it to be much more kind of younger generation friendly, and they completely did away with traditional cameras and photographers and just sent all the journalists out with an iPhone. But let me give you another example, because it comes back to that multi-platform working. I was talking to a big multimedia organization that comes from a bit of a print background, but then they had acquired a TV station along the way. They may send a newspaper reporter or a magazine journalist to go and do a long-form interview with someone, a kind of more human interest and background story. And they will also shoot a video clip with that same person using their iPhone. So absolutely a normal part of the process now.
Do they do any live from the iPhone?
Oh, completely. Yeah, yeah. Well, 2 iPhones, one for the feed and one for the queue. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the kind of bonded cellular manufacturers like LiveView, for example, but LiveView, Teradek, they will all have apps on the phone that let you go live. Now, that's not to say that you might also send a photographer to the scene, and if it's a big story, you actually would probably want a 2-camera setup, even for a stand-up. but being able to put broadcast quality video directly live from a phone, I mean, that's great. The quality of the camera in a phone is more than adequate for TV footage and digital footage. It's a mixed economy. I think if you watch TV news, you'll see material from both sources all of the time on every bulletin.